पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौ शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिः चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om.
We will sing Paramahamsa Sri Ramakrishna on page 51 of your books. Let me read you the translation first. The Guru Supreme, the perfect yogi, devotee of the Mother Divine, incarnation of this age. O Sri Ramakrishna, please accept our reverential salutations again and again. On the cremation ground that was India, thou didst awaken the Divine Mother Kali, the destroyer of all evil. With the immortal waters of the Divine Mother's name, thou didst flood India once again. The sacred memory of the age of truth thou didst bring to this dark age, O austere one, and enabled India to send to country after country pots of sacred waters from the holy rivers of the lives and teachings of her holy sages. In temple, church, and mosque, thou didst worship God with equal faith and fervor. Therefore, the chalice of divine love, which is thy name, fills the world of men and gods.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So today is the second in the series on the worship as spiritual practice. Last time, in the first talk in this series, we saw how worship acts as a bridge connecting the practice of prayer with meditation, and how, as upasana in Vedanta, it becomes a composite practice, including prayer, worship, and meditation all together become the upasana as we practice it today. We also saw last time that worship has a much broader, much larger connotation. It includes the practice of repetition of the divine name, the japa that we do, music, selfless service, virtually everything that we associate with spiritual life can be done as a form of worship. Although the principal focus of this series will be the puja, the ritualistic worship that we do, but it's good to keep at the back of the mind that worship as understood as a spiritual practice is not limited only to ritualistic worship. We also saw last time the main purpose of worship, how it first of all is a good preparatory discipline for meditation. We saw also how worship can strengthen our relationship with God by making God more real to us. And thirdly, how it purifies the mind. Because through worship we learn to see everything as gift from God and learn then how to share it with others. We also saw some secondary benefits of worship, how worship provides sanctification for social institutions and all the different sacraments that we have throughout our life. Worship provides us a sanctifying, a purifying effect on those sacraments. Another secondary benefit of worship is that it strengthens it in social cohesion, formation of spiritual communities where people can come together sharing a common ideal and a common goal. And also finally, how worship provides a sense of security and well-being to the worshipper. So what we'll do today is see how the structure of a worship is. Worship taken as a whole, as a practice. How is this practice structured? In order to understand this, we have to first keep in mind three basic laws that govern worship. The first is the power of invocation. Through the practice of worship, it has become known, or it has been experienced by people, that when we invoke the presence of the God in a special way, it's not simply that we are imagining it, that there is something tangible, something real, something that can be experienced actually happens. So that's the first principle of worship, that it's not simply subjective, it's not simply internal. That when God's presence is invoked, God does manifest in a special way. And this is because throughout the spiritual history of humanity, cutting across spiritual traditions, we see that when a devoted heart calls out, cries out to the divine responds. How that divine response, that can occur in many different ways. Sometimes we see it as God's grace. Sometimes we see it as a miracle. Sometimes we just see it in any number of ways. But this has been the experience of sincere lovers of God across centuries. That when we cry out to God with real love, with a real longing, with not only the faith that God exists, but the faith that God will respond. When a prayer goes out with that anguish in the heart, the divine does respond. And that is one of the first principles behind worship. That it's not something imaginary, that it's something very real. The second principle of worship is what is sometimes called the yatha kratu. In Sanskrit is a Sanskrit term, which means that it comes in an Upanishad called the Chandogya Upanishad. And what it means is that what we think we become, a large part of who we are, a large part of how our personality develops is based on how we think. And I think this factor is not so well recognized. Oftentimes we think that to one way of developing, let me put it this way. Oftentimes we put so much emphasis on the externals of how we come across in the eyes of other people, of how other people view us. And then we do take care about the kind of clothes we wear, the kind of physical appearance we have, not always recognizing that our personality is shaped more by how we think than by our external appearance. Sure, external appearance does make a difference. That's not to be denied. But a greater difference is made by the mind that is lurking within this mind and below the clothes that we wear. And so that principle is recognized in worship, that as is one's thinking, so is one's success. And here, when we're worshipping, thinking means awareness that we are in the presence of the divine. So worship is not some kind of a magic formulas being chanted in some exotic language, but worship does include that when we sit in worship, we are sitting in the presence of God. And that is a second principle for the success in the practice of worship. And that's why it's called Yatha Kratu principle, that as our success in spiritual life is based on the power of our thinking. And a lot of the thinking that we do is not very self-directed. By that I mean, everyone thinks. Well, there are minds and there are thoughts and there are ideas and there are hopes and there are memories. So thinking is kind of continually going on. But a lot of our thinking is just going on as an unconscious movement. Some thought comes and then my mind wanders there, and some other thought comes and my mind goes there. Self-directed thinking means that I tell the mind what it should think. And in order for me to be able to practice self-directed thinking, the mind must be under control. Which means, for instance, if I'm now sitting for worship, at that time, if my mind is under control, then I will tell the mind, right now, don't think of anything other than the activity in hand. Don't think of anything else. And therefore, it applies even for meditation. When the mind is under control, why do we feel distracted when we try to concentrate the mind? Because the mind is not under control. We are supposed to be meditating, we are supposed to be thinking about the object of our meditation, but the mind goes someplace else. And so, success in meditation, success in prayer, success in worship will depend on how much I direct my mind. And when we learn to live with the awareness that God exists, the awareness that not just God exists someplace far away, that God is here right now next to me, holding me by the hand, that itself can be a spiritual practice. Sure, if we have not practiced it this way ever before, we will forget it more often than not. That's okay. But every time I remember it, let me try to hold that thought. And we can go about our day's activities with the awareness that God is by my side. With a little bit of practice, we will see that a forgetfulness of this thought will become less and less and less. And then the sense of security that we have as we go about carrying our life's responsibilities will be immense. Sri Ramakrishna says that when a child holds God's hand, there's a chance that we may let go and fall. But when God holds the child's hand, when a father holds the child's hand, then we are safe. So cultivating the awareness that God is always by my side, we gradually begin to realize the simple truth that God or the Divine Mother is always holding her in our hands. With that sense of assurance, that sense of protection, we are able to then carry out our daily responsibilities in much greater efficiency and much greater confidence. So how we think does influence how we go about our activities and how other people see us. So what it means in the context of worship is that the benefit of the worship will be experienced to the extent we are able to intensify the awareness of our being in the presence of God. And in general, as I said, whenever you go to any place of worship, when you visit a shrine or a chapel, if you do so with the awareness, I'm there in the presence of God, the benefit that we acquire is much greater. And finally, the third principle of worship is the deification of the worshipper. There is a Sanskrit saying called Devo Bhutva Devam Yajet, meaning worship the divine after recognizing your own divinity. So that is one of the central principles of the worship that we do at the Vedanta centers. The worshipper recognizes that there is this core of divinity in my own heart, and there is this infinite manifestation of the divine in the deity that I am worshipping. And the success in worship ultimately would be this distinction between the worshipper and the worshipped is completely eliminated. It's a little bit like the light of a candle, this little light and the light of the sun. As far as light is concerned, they are not different. But of course, we know the distinction. The light of the sun is much bigger, much more stronger than this little lamp. But yet, as light, they are one. And when this light merges in that light, we are then not able to distinguish between the two as light. So that's where worship would ultimately lead us. We see that in the life of Ramakrishna, when he worshipped the Holy Mother, and that one great, that's one of the very significant events in his life. How at the end of the worship, the total distinction was lost. Neither he knew that he was a different being, nor she. So that's where worship will ultimately lead us. So 3 principles: the power of invocation. Secondly, that what we think we become. So how we view our surroundings, how we view the presence of God makes a difference in the success of the worship. And finally, recognizing our own divinity, that we can worship the divine successfully to the extent we are able to recognize the divinity in our own hearts. Based on these three principles, the worship that we do at the Vedanta Center proceeds. One way in which these three principles can be put into practice is to view the divine as a guest. And so that is the general approach. So as we begin a ritualistic worship, we see God or the deity, oftentimes it's the chosen ideal of the worshipper, as a divine guest visiting our home. That's not the only way, of course, to relate to a deity, but in worship, especially the worship that we do at the Vedanta centers, God is seen primarily as a divine guest. And just as we would welcome and accord hospitality to an honored guest, that's how God is welcomed and accorded hospitality. Now, everything occurs at two levels. At one level, we are welcoming the divine in our hearts. And so the mental worship, that's the form mental worship takes. Welcoming the divine in the heart and offering worship to the divine in the heart. And an external worship would mean welcoming the deity on the altar in front of you or in your little shrine and according hospitality to that divine guest. Now, the offerings made to the deity are often symbolical and accompanied by appropriate mantras, appropriate prayers. Because of this, this worship has come down through centuries. The mantras are often in Sanskrit. It's good to recognize, though, that not all of us have to be Sanskrit scholars if we feel like doing worship ourselves. If God is our own, God is not going to reject my offering saying, oh, that's not in a good language. I will accept offering only if it is in Sanskrit. We wouldn't care much for a God who has a discrimination about languages. So while the worship as it is the mantras are in Sanskrit, we don't have to be chauvinistic about language itself. We can feel free to express our thoughts in a way that is meaningful to us, in a way that comes naturally to us. More important than the symbolical offerings and the chanting of mantras is the focusing of the mind on God with love, with devotion and faith. That's important. One might do the externals, the chanting of the mantras and the rituals and everything in a very grandiose way, in a perfect way. But if my heart is not there, then that worship is meaningless in many ways. Done properly, worship helps to make God more real. That God does not then simply remain an idea or simply some kind of a hazy ideal, but God becomes a very real person when worship as a practice becomes meaningful in our lives. Now, how big a worship is, how long does it take? The good thing is that just as hospitalities can be flexible, the length of a worship can be flexible as well. Depending on the time available and depending on the resources available, we can adjust the timing. And we know that the love and reverence involved in worship does not change, although the time and the extent of hospitality offered can change. We know, for instance, if you have an honored guest visiting your home and that guest has an entire weekend to spend with you, then you have a lot more time. You will be able to offer the guest a lot more things and so on. But if that same guest is in a hurry and can visit you only for half an hour, then you may not be able to offer the guest as many things as you would like. You might offer the guest a few things. But yet, that does not in any way alter the, the love and the reverence and the friendship you have with that guest. Exactly in the same way, um, the worship is flexible in many ways. So sometimes you see the worship that we do at the Vedanta Center here, the same worship in some other places where there is more time can become more elaborate. They may have more sets of offerings, a much larger number of mantras to be chanted. But that doesn't mean it's a different worship. It's the same worship, but as I said, depending on the time and the resources and other factors, worship can be very flexible. For instance, the Kali Puja and the Shivaratri that we do here, it's not more than 2 or 3 hours. We begin around 6:30, we finish by about 9 or 9:30. But those two worships can actually go throughout the night. And they can begin around 9 o'clock and go right up till 5 o'clock in the morning. If you are willing to stay up all night, we can try it here. But again, it's not how long that the worship goes will demonstrate the extent of your devotion. The worship can last even 15 minutes, but that doesn't in any way show that your devotion or love is any less. So don't mistake the length of the worship with the extent of the devotion or love for God. So with this general background, the general framework of worship, a worship has 6 steps. Ritualistic worship. The first step is the preparation, and that preparation includes, first of all, cleaning of the place, cleaning of the puja vessels, and readying them for the puja, keeping all the ingredients ready. Much of the worship that we do at the Vedanta Center, these things are done not on the morning of the puja itself, but usually on a day prior to it. But that is a part of the worship. So those of you who are cleaning vessels, you are already participating in the worship, not simply on the day when I sit here and chant the mantras. The worship already has begun when you do the cleaning and do the preparations for the place of worship. Among the second things in the preparation include what is called in Sanskrit as achamana. What I will do today, I'm just kind of giving you a general framework, and the next time, the third talk in this series, maybe we could have some small table and a demonstration about what exactly. So today, just listen, and then you might be able to see it next time. So a second practice in the preparatory thing is called achamana, which means purification of the mouth. Since all the mantras are chanted at the mouth has to be purified, and therefore you might see that I sip water and chant the mantras. That's called achamana. The third thing that we do as a preparation is called sankalpa. It's called sacramental intention. That is converting the puja into a conscious, self-directed, goal-oriented discipline. And I think this is important, not just for puja, but any project that we undertake. You may not do this as a kind of a separate ritual for everything, but it's good to know that before we undertake any activity, the less our activity becomes a mechanical, unconscious work, the better it is. So we need to be aware before beginning any work, small or big, even if it is just vacuuming your room. First of all, that you know why you're doing it, you know how you intend to do it. So what the goal is, and you're doing it in a meaningful way. As I said, really everything can be done as a worship. Even vacuuming your own room can be a form of worship. If you wish as a devotee that God must be present in my home, in the very room I live and work in, then cleaning that room becomes a place where if this is where the divine is going to be, if this is where God is going to be, I need to keep the place clean. And so even cleaning my own room can become an act of worship. And that's why it's called sankalpa. So doing things not unconsciously, but in a very meaningful, self-directed way. One other thing that is done as a preparation is called consecration of water. The main vessel, the water is poured into it, and the water is consecrated by invoking the presence. And oftentimes in our worship, there is one Sanskrit shloka which invokes the presence of the several sacred rivers of India. Sometimes it goes like this. Gange cha Yamune chaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jalesmin Sandhitim Kuru. So Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Kaveri. So all the rivers which are mentioned in ancient Vedanta texts are all invoked, that may the essence of those waters be present in this water which I am using for today's worship. So these are all some of the preparations for the worship. The second main step for the worship is a purification. There are 5 major kinds of purifications done in the worship. The first purification is of the worshipper, whoever the worshipper is. And of course, that first would involve at least taking a shower or a bath. That there is this cleanliness is important, that we wear a clean set of clothes after taking a shower or a bath. So that would be the important first thing that a worshipper has to do. The purification of the place where the worship will be conducted. So you clean the place, you decorate it with flowers, you burn incense, and so on. And then, of course, at the time of worship, there are some mantras are chanted to clean the place in a ritualistic way as well. The third purification done is of the mantra itself. By mantra is meant, mantras are already pure, but because the mantras are going to be uttered by the worshipper, there is a ritualistic way of purifying the mantras that will be used. Fourth is the purification of the ingredients. Now, the puja vessels have already been cleaned externally. So this purification is done by sprinkling water on all the puja items and then with appropriate mantras. And finally, the purification of the deity. Again, the deity is already pure, but the symbol in which the presence of the deity is being invoked could be, sometimes it's a ghata or a jar or a picture or an image, in whichever, or the entire altar, that is also sanctified or purified with sprinkling of water and appropriate mantras. So a lot of the sprinkling that you see me doing when the puja begins are these different steps of purifying that are being done. The third major step in worship, so first is preparation, second is purification. So 5 kinds of purification of the worshipper, the place, the mantra, the ingredients, and the deity. Third step is divinization of the worshipper. I said in the beginning that we have to affirm our own divinity within our heart before we become fit to worship the divine on the altar. There are several steps in this. One is sometimes called, well, not sometimes, it is called pranayama, and many of you are familiar with it. It's the different at different ratios, the inhaling, the exhaling, and retaining of the breath. That is one kind of an internal purification done for the preparation for divinization of the worshipper. The second is a practice called bhuta shuddhi. Bhuta here means the elements. The body is made of material elements, and the 5 primary elements, the subtle elements from which the entire material universe has come, are in the texts mentioned as space, air, water, fire, and earth. Now this has nothing to do with this fire or the light. These are just the essence of these 5 primary elements. And so since the body is made up of these elements, so Bhuta Shuddhi really means it's purifying the elements which constitute my body. So when we take a bath or a shower, we have cleaned ourselves, we have purified ourselves externally. Now through this ritual called purification of the elements, it's purifying ourselves internally. It's a more subtle way of purifying ourselves. It's almost like if there is a building and you take every brick, so it's an old building, and you take out every brick which has become old over the years and you replace it with a new brick which looks exactly like it, one by one. And after you do that, the resulting building is not going to look any different, except that it's become completely new. It's exactly in the same way the divinization of worshipper occurs first by the body and the mind, where every material element from which the body and mind are made are then kind of you're reconstituting your body and mind in this way. Now all this is done through a very creative, vivid imagination. Now, the word imagination is tricky. There are two kinds of imaginations: imagining the unreal and imagining the real. Now, if you're imagining the unreal, that might help you to while away your time a little bit, but it may not really bring about any great change. But imagining the real can bring about a great transformation. So when we try to visualize the presence of God in our heart, in the beginning we are imagining it, because when you close your eyes and if you're seeing God, then you don't need to imagine God's presence. But unless and until, or as long as you don't actually see the divine in the heart, the next best thing you can do is really imagine the divine. But you're not imagining someone or something who is not there. You are imagining someone or something who is already there. So imagining the real is different from imagining the imaginary. And so here in this case, we are imagining the presence of God. And when our mind becomes fully focused, fully concentrated, then we see that what we were imagining was not really imagination, that in fact there is that presence of the divine. The third way the divinization occurs is called Jiva Nyasa. Nyasa really means placing. And Jiva Nyasa is really invoking the presence of the divine in every part of the body. So some of you who have attended the puja might see sometimes I'll be chanting all these mantras, placing. Do you remember some of seeing that? So what essentially is done is invoking and recognizing both. You're invoking and also recognizing that the divine is not simply in the altar in front of you. The divine is not simply pervading the whole universe, but the divine is in a very real way filled in my body and mind, every pore of my skin, every place within my body. So this is a recognition of the divine filling my entire being. So this is called Nyasa. So the divinization therefore occurs, divinization of the worshipper through pranayama, through the control of breath, through purification of the elements, through placing the divine mantras on the different parts of the body, invoking the presence of the divine within us, and through recognizing that God fills our being entirely. The fourth step, there are 6 steps I said. The first we saw was preparation, second was purification, third was divinization. The fourth step is invoking and installing the divine. Now, so the proper puja, the up to this point can be seen as kind of preliminaries of the puja. And the proper puja begins by, first of all, invoking the presence of the deity that is being worshipped. And as I said before, that this involves kind of double invocation. Is first invoking the divinity in the heart and then in front. And so oftentimes, because the worshipper has been, the divinity of the worshipper has been recognized before, so oftentimes they'll take a flower in the palm of the hand, and then there are these, each deity has a meditation verse associated with it called Dhyana Shloka. And then as that verse is chanted, the divinity in the heart of the worshipper, which has already been invoked and recognized, that divinity then is, as it were, transferred onto the flower. Then that flower is placed in front, and then all the worship is offered on that flower. So you see, a ritualistic worship might, to an untrained eye, look like something very dualistic, but there is really, it's not dualistic at all. You're just the same divine, the spirit, because of our present inability to worship the divine as divine, to be able to worship the divine as divine, to see the spirit as spirit, because we tend to see everything outside as objects, where, as it were, we are taking that spirit, the divine, from our heart outside and transferring it onto this flower, seeing that same divine in the altar in front, and then according all the worship to it, all the things that we offer. Could be flowers, incense, worship, food, and all of that. Just as we would offer that to the guest, these things are offered. And at the end of the worship, the same spirit then is then invoked and taken back into the heart of the worshipper. And at the end of the worship, I will come to it later, but I'll just mention it now. The final thing in the worship is actually seeking forgiveness. Forgiveness for according form to the divine who is really beyond form. Giving name to the divine who is really beyond all name. Seeing the divine as outside when the divine is really everywhere. So we recognize the limitations within which we are forced to do all this practice. We recognize the true nature of the divine, and yet, in order to make the ideal more real to us, we are forced in our present state of development to objectify what in essence cannot be objectified. So the worship itself can take, is flexible, as I said. The simplest of worship would be just offering one flower. A more elaborate one would be with 5 items. As often it's sandal paste, flower, incense, lamp, light, and then food, 5. If you would like to do the same worship in a more elaborate way, then it can be done with 10 items. And that begins with, you can see how it accords with the looking upon the divine as a guest. The first of these items are actually offering a seat. So you imagine a guest having come from a distance, and you say, please, please come and sit down. And then the next thing that is offered is called padya, water to wash their feet. Remember, these practices have come from thousands of years ago. So if a guest arrives, the first thing you do is, the road is dusty, wash your feet. And then you give them water for bathing. And you might remember that sometimes I pour water with the ringing of the bell and a chant. That's actually bathing being done, the water being offered, a shower, like, if you like, is being given to the honored guest. So we can find these parallels between how we welcome a guest at home and how the divine is welcomed. So all of these, again, as I said, depending on the time available and depending on resources available, the worship can be as elaborate as offering up to 16 items or offering just one flower. So there is a lot of flexibility possible. The order of worship, very quickly, is almost always the first worship is offered to the guru, the teacher, because it is our teacher that connects us to the divine. So because of that, all worship begins with recognizing the role of one's own teacher in the beginning of one's spiritual life, in one's spiritual journey. So the first worship is to the Guru. Then there are traditionally, there are 5 forms of the divine that are worshipped, that which is what we do in the Vedanta Center. It was started by Shankaracharya in the 8th century. The 5 principal ways in which the divine was worshipped. It's a great practice because what it shows is that no matter which deity we are principally worshipping, but the same divine is present in all. So it's not that the different forms of the divine are competing forms of the divinity, but is that same one divine appearing in many forms. And in order for these different sects and denominations not fight with one another, thinking my God is better than your God or stronger than your God, all of these worship really have according worship to these different forms that are already there. And therefore, they're sometimes called Panchadevata, taken together. In ancient India, they had Ganesha, Shiva, Surya, the sun, Narayana or Vishnu, or Durga, the Divine Mother, as goddess. So these are the 5 deities which stand as representatives of the multifarious ways, in different ways in which the divine can appear. So in order to recognize that the same divine can appear in many different forms, first, this worship is offered to these 5 symbolical representative forms. And then flowers are offered to all other forms of the divinity down the centuries, both mythological and historical. Again, recognizing the presence of the divine in innumerable ways across centuries and across traditions. And finally, we worship the principal deity that is being worshipped. So for Shivaratri, for instance, the principal deity would be Shiva. Kali Puja, just as the name indicates, would be Kali. And of course, here, when Sri Ramakrishna's birthday, we worship Ramakrishna, on Mother's birthday. Here, whether it's Mother's birthday, Swamiji's birthday, we worship all the 3 because it's impossible to think of them as separate. So on all these birthdays that we celebrate, all Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swamiji, Brahmananda, and the direct disciples, all of them are accorded worship. And finally, the 6th and concluding step is the prayer. So at the end of the worship, I mentioned earlier that we pray that whatever way I have done the worship, whichever, in spite of my imperfections, in spite of my weaknesses, you pray that the divine may accept the worship. And then finally, you surrender yourself. Because the principal purpose of worship is the elimination of the ego. If at the end of the worship, my ego is going to be puffed up even more, it's like, how spiritual I am, I'm doing worship, then the whole point is lost. So the reason we recognize the divine in our own heart, if it's done properly, it's a great practice to eliminate this ego, this false I, the false self, which dominates most of our life. So these are the 6 principal steps in worship. The puja framework that we have, it begins with preparation, purification, the 5 kinds of purification, then the divinization of the worshipper, the invocation and installing of the deity, both inside the heart and outside, and then the upachara, or the service, the things that are offered to the divine guest, and finally concluding with prayer and surrender. The arati, the waving of lights that we often do at the end of the worship, and there is also fire worship, sometimes called homa, when offerings are made in fire. Both of these are independent forms of worship. The waving of lights and everything is a complete worship in itself, although oftentimes it appears towards the end and kind of appears like a part of a larger worship, but it is really in itself a complete worship of its own. I'll say just one word before I close about the worship, about the waving of the light. Sometimes you see that on special worship days, uh, usually I worship, I weigh five items. We begin with the lamp, the light. Um, then we have, you might see I'm holding a conch in hand or conch in hand and do it. Um, it's really not the conch itself, but the water in it that's really being waved. The third thing is a piece of cloth. Fourth is a flower, and fifth is this fan. Kind of, it's made of yak tail, by the way. The yaks, which are, if you go to Tibet, you will see. So that fan, chamara, it's called. It's made of their tail. So, what's the significance of these five? Very quickly, as I said, the five basic elements from which the material universe has come. So these five things stand for these five elements. So lamp, of course, stands for light or fire. The conch itself is not the thing. There is a water in it. So water is the second element. The cloth, the warp and woof of the cloth has space in it. So really, the cloth is not just a cloth. It's really a symbol for space. And then the flower. Flower is the symbol of earth. The earth is one of the qualities associated with earth is that of smell, fragrance. Usually you will see when the first rain of the season comes and you go along the riverfront or on a lawn or something, you'll find. So sometimes there's no time to discuss it now, but each of these elements are associated with one of the sensory inputs. So the earth is associated with smell. So flower really stands for the element earth, and then the fan, of course, for air. So the waving of lights really stands for these five primary elements, recognizing that the divine, God, is the source from whom this material universe has come. Now, this is just one instance to show that every little ritual in the worship has a very strong philosophical foundation. When the worship is done, recognizing and knowing the significance of every little thing, the benefit you get is not in any way less than studying an Upanishad or doing a lot of meditation. So sometimes we tend to apply a hierarchy to these things, and sometimes people put worship like almost at the bottom and think that, oh, but meditation is much higher, or the Upanishad, the reasoning is much higher. I don't think that works in spiritual life. Any or all of these, whichever of these practices are meaningful to us, whichever of these practices help us in bringing about an inner transformation, are great. So there is no need to look at something as lower and something as higher. Vedanta is intensely practical. It just says, just do whatever works. If it works, do it. If it doesn't work, there's no point. That's the idea. So this is the general framework of the worship. And the next time we have this talk on puja, we will have a more live demonstration about how these things are actually done at the time of worship. So I think with this background, it might be more helpful to you, more meaningful. The next time we have puja next month, Holy Mother's birthday puja. And so when you attend that puja, hopefully you will be able to participate more fully into what's going on if you think about the things that we have discussed today. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. We bow down to Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. So if you want to know what I said today a little bit more in details with some of the references from ancient texts, I would recommend that you go through this book called The Worship of Ramakrishna. It has a very lengthy introduction called The Science of Worship. So much of what I said today, you'll find some more information, including references from older texts explaining it. Also, it has pretty much the entire worship that we do here, with explanation in Sanskrit about what is done, how it is done. So those of you who are interested in worship will find this book very helpful. Although it's titled Worship of Ramakrishna, the puja framework itself remains same. So no matter which form of the divine you're worshipping, all that would need to be done is only substituting that specific mantra associated with Ramakrishna with the mantra with whichever deity you are worshipping. So this book is helpful for whatever worship we do. So this is something you might like to take a look. We have a few copies in the bookstore. Next Sunday, although the program says that we'll have on worship, we'll have a little change. Next Sunday we have a guest speaker, Pravrajika Viraja Prana. She's a senior nun from our convent in San Francisco, from the Vedanta Society of Northern California. She will be visiting next weekend, and I got the news late. That's why I couldn't include it in the flyer. So I said this will be a good opportunity for us to listen to her reflection. Her subject will be opening the door of the heart. So I would strongly encourage you to come next Sunday when we have this nun, the Vedanta nun, Viraja Prana, speaking on opening the door of the heart. And a following Sunday, that's on 23rd, we will have the final talk in this series on worship with a demonstration. So you come on that one. And on Wednesday, we will continue with the study of the Gita as usual at 7:30. And Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation also will resume as usual. So you're welcome for all of these programs. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. It's on page 3 of your books. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.